You think of the Sahara and you imagine endless sand, a sun that bleaches the horizon white, and a kind of silence that feels like an absence of time itself. But step closer, closer than the worn tracks of modern trucks, closer than the maps economists and meteorologists hand you, and you will find another Sahara, one stitched with the ruins of cities whose stones still keep their secrets. Picture a place where a basalt column leans like a tired sentinel against a sky bruised by dusk. Imagine pottery shards that once sat on banquet tables, now half buried in a dune that shifts with each sigh of wind. These are not the flimsy myths of wanderers at campfires. They are the outline of whole civilizations, scattered like a constellation across a sea of sand, each point a mystery science wrestles with and does not fully conquer. Today, right now, together, we will walk that blurred line between what we can measure and what we only feel. We will stand on the rim of vanished markets, listen for the echo of ancient merchants, and read the faded graffiti that might be a love note or a prayer. I promise revelations, precise dates that refuse to tidy up, artifacts that contradict the neat storyboards of textbooks, and questions that drive the very engines of curiosity. But I also promise honesty. Some things remain stubbornly unresolved. That is the point. We don't seek certainty because certainty is easy. We seek the thrill of not yet knowing, because that unresolved edge is where imagination and investigation meet. When archaeologists first began to map these Saharan ruins, decades after colonial surveyors had drawn only lines and dunes, their tools were crude: compass, notebook, and an urgency born of climate that moves fast. Then came aerial surveys, satellite imagery, and radiocarbon dating, and with each tool the outlines sharpened and problems multiplied. In some cases, stone walls stretched for kilometers in regular grids. In others, monumental mounds rose without clear function. Pottery styles from one site matched those found hundreds of kilometers away, challenging our assumptions about trade and mobility. When you read the scientific papers, dry, measured, careful, you find a pattern of contradiction. Dates from charcoal fragments say one thing, sediment layers say another. Stable isotope analysis of human bones suggests diets that don't match the crops we think were grown. DNA samples whisper of migrations that defy neat maps. These cities are not just mysteries, in the journalistic sense. They are living puzzles that force us to reevaluate climate history, human adaptability, and the very ways empires rise and fall in marginal environments. And yes, there are the stories the desert keeps like a pocket watch. Elders will tell of lost tribes who left behind tools too advanced for local craftspeople to reproduce. Collectors will pay a fortune for a carved stone whose iconography resembles places thousands of miles away. Local myths speak of giants and buried treasures, of drums that once echoed from riverine markets now dry for centuries. Some of these are pure myth, the kind you expect where memory and landscape braid together. Others, oddly, keep showing up in material traces. A drawing of a long-vanished river valley here, a carved human figure taller than the length of a normal man's shadows there. Enough coincidences to make a historian's eye narrow into thought. Our job, when we tell this story, is to hold those strands together without letting one tear the other, to honor the science while savoring the human need for myth. You and I will do both. We will follow maps and follow hunches. We will question data and entertain wonder. Keep that imagination lit. It will be as useful as any radiocarbon sampler when we stand before these ruins. Now picture, if you can, walking with me at dawn along a ridgeline where the wind has stripped the sand away to reveal an old road, paved, yes paved, with stones cut smooth by the passage of countless feet and cartwheels. You can feel the morning chill, and in that thin air the details come forward. A seam of blackened ash where someone lit a ritual fire, the shadow of a wall marked by a line of darker earth, a scatter of beads like stars in the dust. This is not fantasy. These are the first impressions archaeologists had when they traveled here with respectful shoes and meticulous notebooks. But here's where it gets tricky. The road seems to lead to nowhere. It fans outward, becomes 2, 3, then dissolves into a wide, open plain with no obvious habitation nearby. A theory suggests seasonal markets, that people gathered here during flood years to trade livestock and grain. Another suggests ritual processions connected to a vanished water source that still whispers in the geology. Still, for all the evidence of movement, the question remains, who built this magnificent, purposive road, and why abandon it so completely that only the wind remembers its use? We will move from that experience into deeper mysteries, cities whose ruins spread across hundreds of hectares with street grids aligned not to practical convenience but to celestial events, citadels where the foundations are laid in stonework that matches, with uncanny precision, techniques known from coastal urban centers half the continent away, burial mounds that contain skeletons 3 times the height of the average person. Or at least, that is what some stories insist. You will notice how the language around these finds oscillates between sober phrases like anomalous skeletal remains and the more frenzied giants. Now, let's be fair, the term giant in scientific literature is almost always a misinterpretation, decomposition, exaggerated measurement, or heroic storytelling. Yet, the same context where giant appears also holds incontrovertible evidence of long-distance trade, of sudden climate shifts, and of social intricacies that suggest hierarchy, organized labor, and wealth distribution. The Sahara was not an empty expanse. It was often a stage where societies innovated new ways to live, trade, fight, and worship. Why so many of their cities were later swallowed by sand? Well, that is one of our central questions. Imagine standing now at an excavation pit. The ladder rungs cool under your palms, the air scented with sun-baked earth and the metallic tang of old things. The archaeologist hands you a shard of pottery, its external glaze gone but the incised designs clear, tiny, repeating chevrons that match other finds in distant oases. The dating tells us this pottery is roughly from the 2nd millennium BC, yet the chemical composition of the clay suggests it was manufactured from deposits several hundred kilometers away. Trade exists. But trade of what? Grain? Salt? Exotic animals? Or something more ephemeral, ideas, rituals, perhaps even cosmologies? We still don't know the full story. We can map exchange routes and we can model past climates, and we can reconstruct diets from isotopes and bone collagen. But the texture of daily life, the songs sung at market, the exact rituals at funerals, those remain a kind of archaeology of the imagination. That gap can be maddening. It can also be the source of the wildest, most beautiful questions. One of the ways these Saharan cities surprise us is in scale. In remote regions, we sometimes find urban cores with stone constructions occupying dozens of hectares, ringed by agricultural terraces that imply irrigation systems sophisticated enough to support thousands. Sophistication implies knowledge networks, engineers who understood hydrology, leaders who could organize labor, artisans who refined techniques across generations. When we look at the strata, at the charred seeds, at the layers of refuse that speak to diet and economy, we see a picture of dynamic life. At other sites, however, the remains are small, clusters of dwellings centered around shrines, perhaps seasonal camps for pastoralists who moved with rainfall. The contrast is stark. It tells us the Sahara was not a single ecological canvas but a mosaic, and human societies adapted in myriad ways. So when we ask why a city disappeared, the answer must be equally nuanced. Drought, yes, but also political collapse, disease, invasion, or a gradual shift of trade routes that left certain towns stranded. Still, for all the evidence we can gather, many disappearances do not fit neat patterns. There are also the oddities, stone spheres whose manufacture seems beyond local techniques, inscriptions in scripts that, to date, refuse neat classification, isotopic signatures in human remains that point to diets rich in fish in sites hundreds of kilometers from major water bodies. Each anomaly suggests either a new explanation for human ingenuity or a misreading of evidence. This is the reason scholars sometimes disagree so heatedly. One camp will argue for contact across vast distances, ancient voyagers who navigated rivers now dry, or caravans that crossed corridors still visible in satellite radar. Another camp insists these are local innovations, surprising but purely indigenous. Both views can be right in different places. The Sahara was big, and its histories are manifold. When a single site appears to contradict the majority pattern, Rather than forcing it into a tidy narrative, we should step back and accept the possibility that our preconceptions about who could travel, trade, or innovate across harsh landscapes have been limited by modern biases. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn to an enormous ruined gate, its lintel carved with a sequence of symbols that no living language uses today. You brush away sand and find a small bronze pin stuck in the mortar, an object so banal it almost betrays its importance. The pin carries micro traces of oil and plant residue, and when analyzed hints at a body care practice with ingredients sourced from distant valleys. Theories bloom, a cosmopolitan elite with access to far-flung resources, a ritual function for the gate producing pilgrimages like those of later, better-known empires, a center for craft specializations that created goods traded outward by mountain and by caravan. Still, for all the evidence, the motive remains unclear. Why that gate? Why that place? We still don't know whether this was a power center or a sacred threshold, whether it functioned economically or symbolically, or both. And then there are the legends that refuse to die because they are stubbornly plausible. In one valley, elders speak of stones that bleed when moved, a story modern researchers file under folklore until they witness faint red stains in the seams of quarried blocks, iron-rich deposits, perhaps, that leach when fractured. In another, someone claims a chamber beneath the sand houses the bones of men who were twice the height. A claim that, when investigated, yields enlarged femoral fragments that are either pathological anomalies, remnants of different animal species, or, in rare cases, illustrations of the variation in human bodies that challenges our assumptions about average heights and past populations. The human tendency to mythologize is not, in itself, evidence of fantasy. Often, it is a compressed oral memory of some empirical oddity, a real geological quirk remembered as a curse, a real skeletal anomaly remembered as a giant. We have to honor those memories and test them, and in the testing we often find the most interesting surprises. Now let us move inward, deeper into the stories that these stones and bones keep. Consider the city that appears on satellite imagery as a regular grid, nearly invisible until you adjust the contrast and the human-made lines jump into clarity. It sprawls for more than 50 hectares with a central plaza and what might be workshops or administrative blocks. Radiocarbon samples from charcoal and what appears to be an oven date to around 1200 BC. The pottery styles align with a coastal region hundreds of kilometers away, and yet the local lithic sources for tools are entirely indigenous. Here is a place where trade and local craft met. Theories about its demise include prolonged aridity, a shift in trade routes after a newly formed polity to the east redirected commerce, or a sudden epidemic that decimated populations and led to abandonment. There are also less sedate theories: conflict, slave raiding, or even the politicized abandonment of a ritual center after changes in belief systems. Imagine standing in that plaza, the footprints of thousands pressed into the dust, the shadow of a temple pointing toward the rising sun. Picture yourself bargaining for grain, for flint, for an amulet against the heat. The question that haunts archaeologists is not simply when the city died but whether its departure was abrupt or a gradual thinning of life, because each outcome tells a different story about human resilience and vulnerability in extreme environments. We will return, again and again, to this tension between precise measurement and narrative. Archaeology gives us dates, strata, and chemical signatures. It also gives us silence and the occasional, spectacularly specific find that refuses easy explanation. That is why these Saharan sites are so intoxicating. They demand both the scientist's rigor and the storyteller's curiosity. In the coming segments we will examine particular sites in detail: cities that align with stars, citadels with unexplained masonry, tombs with unusual remains, and marketplaces whose commodities suggest trade networks wider than previously imagined. At the end, we will try to weave them together into a single thematic thread about why these mysteries matter. For now, hold the image of that desert road and the road's mysterious vanishing. Keep your senses active. Because in the Sahara, as in all great landscapes of memory, the deeper you look, the more the world rewards you not with simple answers but with questions that change the way you look at humanity itself. The first site to enter our story is a sprawling ruin found along a former riverbed that geologists now call a Paleo Valley. Its name in modern maps is modest, a catalog number used by survey teams, but local storytellers call it the City of the Mirrors, because, in centuries past, travelers found fragments of polished metal that caught the sun and dazzled like water. One-sentence teasers are dangerous pieces of prose. They tempt neatness. Yet here is the temptation: City of the Mirrors, an urban center seemingly wealthy in metalwork, extravagantly connected by trade, and then, inexplicably, abandoned. Archaeological excavation reveals a grid of streets, an inner citadel with substantial foundations built of dressed stone, and specialized workshops that show evidence of metallurgy, slag heaps, crucible fragments, and tools aligned to fine work. Radiocarbon dates from charred timber in domestic contexts point to intensive occupation between roughly 900 and 600 BCE. But here's where it gets tricky. Isotopic analysis of soil suggests the primary metalworking ore did not come from the immediate vicinity. Instead, it came from sources many hundreds of kilometers away, sources that would require well-organized, long-distance exchange. Historical context ties this to an era of intensified trans-Saharan exchange, a time when rivers were more generous and caravans could move with relative ease. Yet something shifts. The later strata show a cessation of high-status goods, a simplification of pottery styles, and fortified walls built hastily. One theory suggests increased raiding as a driving force. Wealth made targets and local elites retreated or were slain. Another posits environmental stress, water receding, yields dropping, people moving to more stable zones, and a third invokes political consolidation by a rival center that redirected trade. Still, for all the data, we cannot say with certainty why the City of the Mirrors declined when it did. We can imagine merchants stacking mirrors and beads onto camelbacks, watchmen lighting beacons that turn night into an echo of day. We can picture the markets at dawn, goods arriving by river and by caravan, the smell of metal and oil in the air. We still don't know whether those mirrors were primarily status markers, ritual objects, or trade goods meant for markets beyond the desert's edge. Alongside the City of the Mirrors lies a more confounding find: several graves, shallow and hurried, containing human remains that, at first glance, belonged to ordinary people. Yet buried within, and plainly not placed by accident, are objects of foreign manufacture, beads made from shell species native to distant coasts, fragments of woven cloth dyed with a palette matching far-off lands, and a set of small, carved figures whose style has no known analog locally. This suggests more than intermittent trade. It implies the presence of people whose lives were intertwined with networks spanning vast ecological differences. Perhaps they were itinerant merchants who chose this city as a hub. Perhaps they were diplomatic envoys or refugees. Some scholars suggest the city's wealth derived from its role as an intermediary between inland resources and coastal demands. Others note that lavish burial goods often signify social strategies, elites demonstrating their connections in death as in life. Still, for all the artifacts, the social structure, who ruled, who labored, who worshipped, remains a guesswork of the sharpest order. Imagine, now, walking through the workshops, the air heavy with the metallic tang of recent smelting. Picture a craftsman bending over a newly hammered mirror, his hands black with soot, his face lit by the orange flare of a charcoal fire. You can see the patterns being incised, motifs perhaps linked to cosmological ideas, sun and horizon, river and journey. There is a humanist lock to all this: artisan herdlings, bargaining, family lines teaching craft, men and women whose lives were not simply subsistence but skilled expression. That human detail complicates any single explanation for decline. When a political disruption occurs, these craftspeople do not vanish. They are displaced, they change techniques, they adapt. The archaeological trace can mislead if we assume abandonment equals extinction. Yet sometimes abandonment does mean physical departure. Dunes swallow thresholds, wells run dry, and homes are left standing until the wind takes them. We still don't know what precisely caused that city's abandonment: an insurgency, a slow withdrawal, a climate event, or a combination of factors shaped by decisions of people whose names we will never learn. As we step away from the City of the Mirrors, consider the sensory residue that remains: the glint of polished metal, the hollow of a hearth where a family once ate, the curl of a child's toy carved from bone. These are the small things that anchor us. They whisper that these were not just nodes on a trade map but living communities, eyes turning to one another across courtyards, voices negotiating prices, mothers teaching daughters how to mix dyes. No single theory can honor all of those human lives while also explaining the structural failures or triumphs of entire cities. That is the heart of our work, blending microhistory and macroanalysis, honoring the mundane and the monumental. The star grid of Tin-Bahru, an uncanny city whose streets are laid out not to the sunlit practicalities of trade but to the slow march of stars across the sky. Imagine a plan so precise you can stand in its center and watch the angles of the avenues line up with the rising of particular constellations. That single sentence is both invitation and provocation, because Tin-Bahru challenges how we think desert communities organized space and meaning. The site stretches across some 60 hectares, with streets forming a near-perfect orthogonal grid oriented about 20 degrees east of true north, and a central plaza where a raised platform, some 40 meters across, once supported timber columns now gone to rot. Radiocarbon from charred seeds and household ash puts intensive occupation between roughly 800 and 300 BC, and yet the astronomical alignments are unmistakable. On clear nights, the axis points to the heliacal rising of a star cluster that would have occurred with regularity during the city's heyday. Now, let's be fair, alignments can be coincidental. Still, for all the evidence of calendrical intent, stone markers at precise intervals, a line of small cairns that track the horizon, scholars argue for a civic calendar rooted in celestial observation. One theory holds that Tin-Bahru functioned as a ritual center, a place where agricultural cycles, pilgrimage, and taxation synchronized with the heavens. Another claims the grid was a method of social control, a spatial ideology by which elites mapped power onto the landscape in the guise of cosmic order. Yet another voice suggests an engineering rationale. Alignments help channel wind across streets to ventilate living quarters or to move grain through pneumatic systems now lost. Picture yourself walking those streets at dusk, the air cooling like a hand laid across your brow, watching shadows lengthen in patterns that repeat with the stars. Workshops dotted the alleys, pottery, textile looms, and small observatories that might have doubled as shrines. Excavations turned up ostrich eggshell beads, glass paste that echoes coastal manufacture, and an unusual system of measuring rods found in a cache beneath the central platform. Rods marked in units repeated across the urban fabric. Trade, ritual, engineering, Tin-Bahru insists on multiplicity. Still, for all the precision in stone and soil, we cannot agree whether the grid encoded theology, economy, or something in between. We still don't know. Further inland, where dunes give way to a stony hamada, lies a different kind of mystery, the citadel of tall stones, an enormous fortress perched like a chess piece at the mouth of a dry river. One-sentence teaser, citadel of tall stones, an imposing stronghold with masonry so refined it rivals coastal ports, yet built in a place with no obvious strategic maritime connections. The citadel occupies a raised knoll and is ringed by terraces and stepped retaining walls measuring nearly 6 meters in thickness in places. The stones themselves are dressed to fit with such refinement that mortar seems almost decorative. Radiocarbon and optically stimulated luminescence, OSL, dates cluster between 600 BC and 100 CE, a period of shifting trade routes and growing magnetic cultural exchanges across North Africa. The quality of stonework mirrors techniques seen in some Mediterranean contexts, raising questions about technological transmission. Inside the citadel, archaeologists found storage pits, some with remains of millet and domesticated sorghum, together with exotic imports, amphory fragments carrying residues of wine, beads carved from conch shells from distant marine environments, and a cache of copper ingots, whose isotopic signature suggests were from a source hundreds of kilometers away. One theory suggests the citadel was a coastal city's inland satellite, a secure depot for goods moved during seasonal floods. Another proposes it was a cultic center where weather and war were braided into single rituals, explaining the monumental architecture as both defense and sacred display. A more controversial hypothesis invokes mercenary elites who controlled caravan routes and forged a hybrid architectural agenda to legitimize their rule. Imagine climbing the citadel's ramp at sunrise, wind scouring the terraces, and below you caravans unfurl like the ribs of a sleeping animal, camels, men, and goods, moving under the watchful eye of a tower where a standard flies with a symbol no longer in living memory. The citadel's walls speak of organized labor, specialized skill, and wealth. Still, for all the evidence of connectivity and power, we cannot say who the citadel's rulers claimed to be, how they fell out of authority, or whether the site was ever truly a single political unit, or rather a federation of interests. We still don't know. Not far from these stone bastions, in a low basin that once hosted seasonal lakes, archaeologists unearth a series of tombs that have become a locus for both science and sensationalism. Long, narrow burial chambers containing skeletons that, when articulated, seem to exceed expected human height for their periods. One-sentence teaser: the long-house tombs, burials whose remains rekindle whispers of giants in the oral memory. Let's step carefully here. Scientific excavation recorded limb bones larger than those from contemporary cemeteries nearby, femoral lengths suggesting individuals significantly taller than statistically average human heights in the region. But here's where it gets tricky. Skeletal variation can be produced by many things: genetic outliers, pathological conditions, or misattribution of bones from other species. Stable isotope analysis indicates these people had diets high in protein and specific marine resources at times when the basin was trickling with water, a dietary advantage that could, over generations, influence stature. Another set of scholars argues that selective burial practices might have reserved monumental tombs for elite families who happened to carry alleles favoring larger body size. Mythic elements are unavoidable, local elders tell of men whose heads grazed the canopies, giant skeletons unearthed by rainstorms, and a guardian spirit that bestows tall stature as both curse and mark of favor. Imagine lowering a lantern into the tomb, the light catching on bone and the shadow of a jaw that seems to belong to someone out of scale. How your imagination leans towards story is part of human nature. Science insists on caution. Folklore insists on grandeur. Both are valuable. Still, after exhaustive osteological analysis and attempts to find modern genetic continuity, uncertainty remains about the prevalence, cause, and meaning of these tall individuals. We still don't know. And then there is the Oasis of Echoes, a place where architecture experiments with sound as if space were a musical instrument. One-sentence teaser: Oasis of Echoes, an urban complex engineered for acoustics, where plazas, courtyards, and water channels produce intentional sonic effects that could have shaped ritual and governance. This site is built around a narrow, perennial spring that feeds a central basin. The public architecture is unusual: colonnaded halls with curved walls, narrow alleyways that funnel wind, and a sequence of stepped platforms that catch sound and amplify it across short distances. Ethnoacoustic analysis reveals that certain plazas would naturally enhance low-frequency sounds, drums, spoken liturgy, while other spaces attenuated noise, creating intimate pockets of speech. Occupation dates span from about 400 BC to 500 CE, and artifacts suggest a mixed economy of pastoralism and irrigated agriculture. One interpretive model emphasizes the role of orchestrated speech, rulers and priests manipulating acoustics to command crowds, to convey authority, to ritualize law. Another reads the acoustic design as functional. Movement of water and storage of grain required specific architectural solutions that unintentionally had sonic consequences. A romantic angle, inevitable in storytelling, suggests the city hosted singers of the spring, groups whose songs carried messages encoded in harmonic patterns to distant listeners. Picture yourself standing in a colonnade as a low chant begins. The sound swells in the air, the spring's water answering with a soft slap on stone, and suddenly you sense that speech and water were braided into governance. The Oasis of Echoes reveals how human perception, what we can hear, became a tool as powerful as what we could see or touch. Still, despite acoustic models and experimental reproductions, we cannot conclusively say whether the sounds were intentionally designed for ritual or simply a happy byproduct of practical architecture. We still don't know. Another chapter of this story lies with the Market of Shells, a trading hub in the middle of the desert whose commodities suggest routes that defy expectations. Shells, ivory, dyes, and salt, items whose origins range from the Atlantic coast to coastal rivers far to the south. One-sentence teaser, market of shells, an inland bazaar that turns a desert lane into a mirror of the sea. Excavations reveal layered strata of commerce, continuous deposits of marine shell ornaments across 3 centuries, organic residues in ceramic vessels indicating trade in fermented beverages, and a remarkable ledger, a set of incised wooden tablets preserved in anoxic mud, that lists goods using a pictographic system partially deciphered by linguists. The ledger's entries align with geochemical signatures. Beads from conch and cowra match coastal species. Residues of red dye correspond to plant families grown in humid river valleys, and traces of certain isotopes indicate the presence of goods from far to the south. All of this paints a picture of robust connectivity, a market that functioned as an entrepot, where desert caravans met riverine traders, where inland products like salt were exchanged for coastal luxuries. One compelling theory suggests the market of shells was less a fixed urban agglomeration and more a seasonally recurrent festival, a place where communities converged at particular hydrological moments to trade and renew social bonds. Another argues the market was a permanent urban node with resident merchant classes and storage architecture. There is also a more speculative voice that sees the market as evidence of a maritime donor culture, coastal polities sending emissaries inland to secure rarities. Picture yourself at a stall, the smell of crushed carmine dye cutting through dust, cowrie shells piled like white teeth, and a trader counting beads by the light of a lantern. Imagine languages layered upon one another, contracts struck across different legal traditions, and the power of objects to tell stories of distance. Still, despite ledgers and residue analysis, we cannot fix the market's rhythm with certainty. Was it seasonal festivity or year-round commerce? We still don't know. Perhaps the most haunting sight is a sunken library in what was once a vast lakebed, a collection of discarded scroll cases, wooden shelving fragments, and clay tablets partially charred but legible enough to suggest knowledge production on a scale unexpected for such a landscape. One-sentence teaser, the Sunken Library, a repository of learning submerged beneath mud, with fragments of texts that hint at cosmologies and bureaucracies lost to the desert. The remains consist of stacked writing cases, stylus fragments, and sealed jars with traces of inks. Where preservation allows, texts speak in a syntax that borrows from multiple known scripts, some graphemes echoing labor records of nearby regions, others suggestive of liturgical forms. Radiocarbon places intense book production and archival activity between 300 BC and 200 CE, a period corresponding to trade intensification in adjacent corridors. One hypothesis proposes that this library served as an administrative archive for a broad polity, compiling tax records, legal decisions, and astronomical tables used for both governance and ritual. Another posits a religious institution collecting sacred texts and performing seasonal renewals. A more imaginative theory suggests a scholar monastery hybrid that attracted itinerant thinkers across vast ecological zones. Yet the most dramatic explanation for the library's demise invokes a cataclysm, a sudden flood event that buried sections of the archive in anaerobic mud, preserving them only to be later revealed by erosion. Image yourself, knees sinking in mud as you pry open a waterlogged case and a fragment of script crumbles in your hands. Letters half-formed, marginalia scrawls, a diagram of constellations that matches patterns laid in stone at Tin-Bahru. There is something poignantly human about finding lists of names, tax tallies, and perhaps a hurried scribble of a poet's verse among bureaucratic records. Still, the texts are fragmentary, the languages are stubbornly hybrid, the purposes overlapping. We still don't know who exactly compiled this knowledge, how widely it circulated, or the full extent of what was lost. Across these sites a pattern emerges, societies producing sophisticated architecture, craft specializations, and long-distance connections. They engineered water, harnessed wind, oriented cities to the sky, and stored knowledge in ways that suggest institutional complexity. But the pattern is not uniform. Some places are clearly urban, others seasonal, some show evidence of elite social stratification, others of more egalitarian pastoral groups. This mosaic undercuts any simple story of linear progress or unidirectional decline. It admonishes us to avoid the siren song of a single explanation in favor of a layered approach, one that accepts local ingenuity, long-distance exchange, climatic variability, and the unpredictable role of human decision-making. We have climatic proxies that reveal episodes of increasing aridity coinciding with the depopulation of certain sites. We have archaeological strata showing continuity of craft amid political collapse in others. The human record in the Sahara is neither a tale of triumph nor merely a chronicle of failure. It is a set of overlapping experiments in living in marginal landscapes. Imagine, for a moment, standing on a dune between these sites, the wind pulling at a scrap of cloth caught on an exposed post. Under your feet lies a palimpsest of footsteps, some recent, some very ancient. You can imagine a market caravan passing, a priest performing a ritual aligned with the stars, a family burying their dead with imported shells, a scribe slipping a document into a case destined for the library. The stories braid. They also resist final summarization. For every artifact we unearth and interpret, there are countless traces that do not yield their meaning without more context, more excavation, more analysis, more questions that demand more sophisticated models. We still don't know the full social vocabulary of these people, the particularities of their law, the breadth of their beliefs, or the musical contours of their ceremonies. Yet the things we do know are enough to transform the Sahara from a void into a place buzzing with human endeavor, a region full of networks crisscrossing the map like roots under soil. And so the second major mystery of these landscapes is not solely their vanished cities but the ways in which knowledge and myth travel together. Folklore has often preserved kernels of reality, giant bones remembered as men of old, bleeding stones as iron deposits, songs that reference rivers now dry. Those kernels guided early explorers to sites that would prove archaeologically significant. But oral memory is also elastic. It stretches, compresses, and reweaves the past into narratives that serve current needs. That elasticity is precisely what makes studying the Sahara such a human project. You must be careful with the stories while honoring their persistence. Throughout the last century, when archaeologists first began systematic work in these regions, they frequently dismissed local accounts as romantically colored but unreliable. Over time, the discipline matured. Today, archaeologists work with community elders, integrating oral histories with material science. That intersection has led to insights that would have been impossible otherwise, like identifying ceremonial stone alignments from memory or locating burial grounds marked in song. Still, when we synthesize these narratives with scientific evidence, tensions emerge, dates that don't align with oral chronologies, artifacts that belie remembered heroes. Those tensions are not failures. They are invitations to deeper inquiry. Listen, if you press your ear to a stone at one of these sites, what do you hear? Not literal voices, of course, but the attenuation of time, a hum of production, the rhythm of looms, the clatter of trade, the whisper of a ritual chanted by elders. The emotional resonance of such sites is crucial. They are an archive of human aspiration and memory. When a site like Tin-Bahru aligns with stars, when a citadel stands with stones cut to the perfection of an engineer's dream, when long bones provoke stories of giants, when plazas make the human voice carry like a bell, when markets mix shells and desert dust, and when libraries are swallowed under mud, we are not simply cataloging curiosities. We are conversing with people across time. Their choices, their ways of ordering space, making law, designing rituals, and trading goods, tell us about the universals and the particularities of human life. Still, the record is incomplete, the texts fragmentary, the stories tangled. We still don't know all the languages they used, all the alliances they forged, or all the reasons they left. There is a humility in that not knowing, but also a fierce beauty. The Sahara resists tidy endings because its people made lives adapted to flux, seasonal rainfall, shifting sand, changing trade corridors, and the politics of region and time. Their cities rose and fell, not always in the ways our modern metaphors expect. Perhaps the most important lesson is this: human ingenuity often thrives in marginal places precisely because marginality requires creativity. Water management, caravan organization, craft specialization, each is a response to constraint. When we frame the Sahara as a blank, we diminish that ingenuity. When we recognize its palimpsest of urban, ritual, and economic layers, we begin to read a narrative rich in adaptation. Yet the mysteries persist. We still don't know who first mapped the stars onto Tin-Bahru's streets, who called the citadel home, whether the long-house tombs housed giants or exceptional elites, whether the Oasis of Echoes was designed for sound or simply happened to produce it, whether the market of shells was permanent or seasonal, or who penned the documents of the Sunken Library. Each site keeps a riddle, and each riddle shades our understanding of what civilization meant in these landscapes. If you are still with me, picture the next phase of the story: the scientists with instruments leveled on tripods, the local storytellers pointing out landmarks in gestural maps, the students learning to sieve, and the families whose lives intersect with these ruins today. Archaeology is not a pursuit of ghosts for the elite, it is a community enterprise that affects living people, those who find their ancestors' names in tablets, and those who find ghostly footprints etched into a dune by erosion. As we proceed, we'll examine further sites, 6 to 8 in total as we promised at the outset, and probe their data, artifacts, and myths. We'll oscillate between the pragmatic and the poetic, between calibration curves and campfire tales. Along the way, we'll ask what these places teach us about resilience, about memory, about the human habit of leaving traces in places where few expect them to persist. Still, at every turn, we will face the same conclusion: tantalizing evidence and stubborn absence sit together like two halves of a story. We still don't know. The glassworks of Sahl al-Abayad. Imagine a low plain where, under a slate sky at dawn, the ground appears mottled with the pale sheen of crushed sand that catches the light like a frost. One sentence teaser would call it a center of glass and glaze, a place where artisans tamed sand and fire to make objects that shone like water. But the simple sentence cannot hold the surprise. Here are furnaces whose vitrified slag blankets large swaths of the site, rows of bead molds, and shards of translucent green and blue glass so consistent in chemical composition that their manufacture points to a shared workshop tradition over centuries. The site sprawls across perhaps 30 hectares, with separate quarters for workshops, domestic compounds, and a central administrative complex with a possible guild hall marked by benches and hearths. Radiocarbon dates from charcoal-lining furnace pits place the heart of activity between about 700 BC and 200 BC, a period when long-distance exchange intensified across north-south and east-west axes. Petrographic and trace element analysis reveals that some of the glass draws from high-alkali sands found in distant basins, while colorants, cobalt, manganese, copper, match ores from other regions entirely, suggesting either raw material trade or the movement of master craftsmen. Now, let's be fair. Glassmaking can spring up wherever the necessary raw materials coalesce, and simple diffusion of technique can explain many instances of similar manufacture. Still, for all the technical explanations, the scale of Sahl al-Abayad's operations points to more than local craft. It implies institutional organization, an economic logic, a demand network that turned cups and beads into valuable commodities beyond their utility. One theory casts the glassworks as part of an artisan class economy, with specialized families passing skill across generations and assembling luxury objects for elite consumption inland and abroad. Another theory sees the site as a production node in a larger imperial economy, where raw glass was produced centrally and then distributed to satellite workshops for finishing, an early form of industrial scaling. A more romantic hypothesis imagines itinerant master glassmakers traveling with caravans, setting up transient kilns that grew into the permanent compound we now uncover. But here's where it gets tricky. At the margins of the workshops, archaeologists found a set of ceremonial deposits, beads placed deliberately in sunken pits, small glass mirrors wrapped in organic textiles, and a cache of figurines half-formed and intentionally shattered. Were these ritual offerings to sanctify the fire and the transformation of sand into object? Were they the discarded products of apprenticeship trials? Or were they signs of rapid decline, artworks broken in haste, offerings made in a plea to preserve craft during a crisis? Local oral tales speak of the glass that sings, a legend that when fire was coaxed in certain ways the furnaces emitted a piercing tone, and that only the master could hear the right pitch. A few elders claimed their ancestors carried secret tunes used to tune the kills, part recipe, part song. Picture yourself crouched at a furnace mouth, feeling the heat on the back of your neck, the glass inside bubbling like a captured sunset, the master turning it with a paddle while a child watches wide-eyed. The human scenes anchor the technical data, families, apprentices, the community that depended on the kills for income, the traders who came to buy beads and mirrors. Still, for all the slag analysis and workshop plans, we cannot say whether Saul al-Abayad's glass was primarily local luxury, an export product, or a ritual medium whose breakage signified economic or spiritual shifts. We still don't know. Farther along the map, the labyrinthine wells of Qasr al-Majjar present a different kind of puzzle, an engineered landscape where water management becomes as much a social technology as a physical one. One-sentence teaser, Qasr al-Majjar, the city that tunneled to water, building labyrinths below its streets to trap, store, and redistribute the desert's scarce wetness. Now, understand that in arid places water engineering is often the clearest sign of political organization, but here the scale is astounding. A network of connected cisterns, subterranean channels cut into bedrock, and narrow service galleries that permitted access for cleaning and maintenance. Some cisterns hold stratified deposits of silt and botanical remains, allowing us to reconstruct cropping sequences and watering regimes. Others bear the scars of rhythmic maintenance indicating a planned civic labor force. OSL dating pegged parts of the system to as early as 1000 BC, with major refurbishments around 300 BC, suggesting long-term occupation and recurrent investment. The social implications are immense. One interpretive frame envisages Qasr al-Majjar as a state-level center controlling water distribution, levying taxes in kind, organizing irrigation shifts, and using water as a lever of power. Another reads the labyrinth as a cooperative infrastructure of small-scale farmers and pastoralists pooling labor to survive seasonal droughts, a model of resilience built from below. A third theory proposes that the subterranean galleries also serve symbolic functions, pathways of initiation for religious cults, sacred descent rituals simulating the journey to the underworld or the return to fertility. The mythic overlay insists that a keeper of wells once ruled with a reed staff, controlling the breath of life itself, and that those who misused water were cursed by the stone's spirits. Picture yourself walking through a low, cool passage, torchlight throwing the walls into sharp relief, the echo compressing your voice into a slow drumbeat, and a faint smell of damp, ancient reed. You imagine the meticulous teamwork required to keep such a system running: watchmen scheduling access, teams dredging silt, lever systems sealing and opening channels. But here's where it gets tricky. The archaeology shows episodes of sudden disuse and then later reoccupation, not a simple trajectory of decline. Was abandonment caused by political rupture, a conquering power uninterested in maintaining local wells, or by a climatic shift that made the infrastructure uneconomical? Or was it social? Did patterns of mobility change, with nomadic groups expanding and de-emphasizing fixed water infrastructure in favor of ephemeral wells? Still, for all the engineering and the human stories, the labyrinth resists final collapse into any single narrative. We still don't know. Not far as the crow flies, a site called Tamar yields a mystery that blends death and sound into a single haunting motif. One-sentence teaser, the singing bones of Tamar, tombs arranged to produce harmonic effects when struck, as if funerary architecture tuned the afterlife. Excavation here revealed clusters of burial chambers where the placement and spacing of ossuary pits, earthen mounds, and stone slabs create resonance patterns when the wind moves or when stones are struck, measurable harmonics that any sensitive audiophile would call intentional. Ethnoacoustic tests reveal that the chambers produce distinct low-frequency overtones that carry across the cemetery on certain seasonal winds. Radiocarbon dating places ceremonial activity between 500 BC and 100 CE, a period of regional ritual elaboration. Osteological analysis shows varied burial positions, some extended, some flexed, along with grave goods like perforated whalebone pendants unlikely for an inland site, and flutes or reed instruments whose presence implies ritual music. One interpretive model argues that sound was integral to funerary practice, Amplified tones help communicate with the dead, scaring off predators, or marking time in nocturnal rites. Another model suggests the acoustic properties were coincidental, byproducts of building on particular bedrock strata or using available stone sizes, but later ritual actors exploited them as meaningful. There is also a more provocative hypothesis that certain elite lineages were memorialized through sonic graves, deliberately constructed so that their memory could be invoked by a specific tone, thereby linking lineage, sound, and authority in a material practice. Local myth adds a layer of grandeur. Elders speak of the bones that sing when the moon is full, a poetic memory perhaps anchored in the fact that windy nights do make the cemetery sigh. Picture yourself standing in the center of such a cemetery as dusk falls, feeling the hairs on your arms prick as a wind sweeps through in a frequency that seems to make the stones and bones vibrate underfoot, a natural phenomenon elevated into meaning by human minds searching for continuity with the dead. Still, for all the experiments, the tuned acoustics measured in labs, and the ethno-historic reflections, we cannot confidently claim whether the sonic properties were intentionally designed, later appropriated, or merely observed and ritualized after the fact. We still don't know. Another bewildering place is the Terrace of Painted Faces, a sprawling facade carved into a hillside and plastered with pigments that have retained surprising vibrancy beneath protective layers of silt. One-sentence teaser would note, Terrace of Painted Faces, a monumental mural whose iconography, style, and pigments suggest artistic connections that cross ecological divides. The mural extends for over 100 meters, depicting rows of stylized faces interspersed with animals, boats, and abstract geometric motifs. Pigment analysis shows the use of mineral-based reds and yellows as well as organic dyes that needed careful extraction and preparation. Some faces wear headdresses resembling coastal designs, others carry objects that look like riverine fishing tools, while certain panels depict desert animals rendered in a way that resonates with motifs found in other Saharan and Sahelian rock art. Radiocarbon dates from organic binders suggest phases of painting from about 900 BC to 400 BC, implying either a long-standing shrine revisited over generations or a community of artists with an enduring tradition. Interpretations range widely. Some propose a syncretic religious iconography, a meeting of traditions where coastal, riverine, and desert peoples inscribed their alliances in pigment. Others see it as a political statement, a visual codex announcing rulership through images that signaled affiliations with different ecological zones. A third view considers the mural an artistic school whose repertoire was circulated by traveling artists, religious specialists, or merchant guilds, creating a signature style identifiable across disparate sites. The mythic element is potent. Local storytellers call it the Face Road, a place where ancestors watched caravans pass and offered protection. Children are taught that the painted faces are stern guardians that turn their eyes to warn those who steal or lie. Picture yourself standing before that terrace at sunrise, the colors muted into a gentle glow, and moving along the row as if reading a book of faces, each one a chapter, each one a memory. The human impulse to paint is the same as the impulse to build, to assert presence, meaning, and belonging. Still, for all the pigments analyzed, for all the stylistic comparisons, we cannot yet stitch together the full narrative of who commissioned the Terrace of Painted Faces, how the iconography evolved, or the precise functions, religious, political, or mnemonic, it served. We still don't know. Then there is the curious phenomenon of the shadow roads, ancient tracks visible from the air as long, straight lines that traverse the landscape for scores of kilometers, disappearing and reappearing like scars on the desert's skin. One-sentence teaser, shadow roads, mysterious thoroughfares etched into the land that speak to planned movement over distances seemingly impractical for their apparent use. Ground survey reveals that many of these roads were not simple paths worn by feet but deliberately prepared surfaces, compacted layers, occasional flag stones for drainage or to mark milestones, and alignments that sometimes lead to known water sources but in other cases curve toward nothing obvious. Dating such linear features is challenging, but where datable material is present, charcoal, trampling layers, or adjacent structures, some roads correspond to the first millennium BC. Three principal theories vie for acceptance. ceremonial processional ways linking ritual centers across vast distances, practical caravan routes designed to optimize travel by following lines of stone and low-lying reeds, or territorial markers, constructed as a way to claim space and signal a polity's reach to rivals. A hybrid hypothesis suggests roads served multiple functions at once: practical in peace, ceremonial in festival season, and symbolic as a sign of control. Local legends cast them as the paths of giants or of gods crossing the land, their footsteps leaving indelible lines. Imagine following such a road at dawn, the horizon flaring pink, the surface packed firm beneath your boots, and every kilometer a mental peg, some leading to ruins, others to nothing. The roads are both connective tissue and enigma. Still, despite careful survey and remote sensing, many shadow roads defy easy chronological attribution and purpose. We still don't know each of these sites, and I could keep naming more because the Sahara is generous in its confounding gifts, forces us to reconcile the tangible and the imagined. At Sal al-Abayad we study the chemistry of glass and feel the heat of the kiln. At Qasr al-Majjar we model hydrological engineering and sense the communal grind of maintenance. At Tamr we measure resonant frequencies and stand in a cemetery where wind and ritual intersect. At the Terrace of Painted Faces we analyze pigments and look into painted eyes that once watched the caravan trails. On the shadow roads we trace lines that demand explanation. These investigations share a method: test, model, compare. But they also share an ethic: to listen to stories, to engage with communities, and to refuse the arrogance of definitive closure when evidence remains ambiguous. In this embrace of not knowing there is humility and also a kind of moral clarity. These are human places, not puzzles to be wholly consumed by outsiders. We owe the people who live among these ruins explanations that respect both material data and the lived memories tied to place. Still, while we advance methods, ancient DNA, isotope mapping, high-resolution satellite radar, and experimental archaeology, answers do not arrive like neat gifts. They come as complicated mosaics, fragments that fit and others that contradict. We still don't know. The bronze causeway of Al-Mazrah. A single sentence will do injustice but will do at least this. Imagine a roadway paved not with simple cobbles but with a deliberate layering of bronze sheets and stone, laid like an offering across a salt plain, a route whose very surface is an argument about power, display, and technological daring. The causeway stretches for nearly 15 kilometers where it meets the shallow marshes of an erstwhile lake, its edges flanked by regularly spaced posts whose post holes still show the dark stain of preserved timber. The engineering is precise enough to suggest coordinated planning and sustained investment. Radiocarbon dates from embedded organic packing material cluster surprisingly in the mid-1st millennium BC, an era when regional polities were consolidating control over trade arteries. The bronze itself, an alloy with a distinct tin-to-copper ratio, was analyzed and found to contain trace elements matching ores from a cluster of inland mines rather than coastal deposits, which raises questions about procurement and the political economy that could control both metal and manpower. Key discoveries include not just the paved surface but adjacent workshops where molds and casting sprues lie scattered, and a line of small, pillared platforms that may have served as way stations or altars. One theory frames the causeway as a ceremonial processional road, elites processed along its gleaming surface, their passage sanctified by bronze that flash light across the salt flat, creating a highway of prestige. Another argues for a practical function. The bronze sheathing resisted abrasion from salt and water, making travel possible where foot and wheel would otherwise be mired, effectively turning a treacherous marsh into a stable corridor. Yet a third, more political hypothesis sees the causeway as a statement, a deliberately ostentatious piece of infrastructure meant to announce dominion over an ecologically marginal zone, a material manifesto laid down to be read by rivals and allies alike. Local memory remembers the place as the Road of Kings, and adds the mythic detail that the causeway rang like a bell when the winds crossed it, that the sound warned of approaching armies or of storm. Picture yourself walking its length at dawn, the bronze cool beneath your palm but gleaming in the first light, and imagine the sensation of being part of a grand, slow-motion parade that is both ritual and declaration. The reflex to read the causeway as either emblematic or functional is a human one, and both readings can be true at once. The same structure can be engineering and spectacle, utility and symbol. Still, for all the metallurgical assays and the painstaking planimetric survey, we cannot decisively say whether traffic here was primarily sacred or utilitarian, whether the bronze was locally produced for practical reasons or deliberately commissioned to signal wealth and control. We still don't know. A different kind of mystery breathes beneath the dunes of the vanished harbor of Abaris, a coastal memory stranded inland by shifting shorelines and the slow retreat of the sea. One-sentence teaser: Abaris, a harbor city now marooned miles from the modern coast, with ship fittings, amphory shards, and tidal architecture that insists there was once a seafaring economy here. In situ finds include mooring stones set into bedrock, carved bollards, and layered sediment with marine mollusk shells interleaved with human detritus. Clear testimony that saltwater influenced human activity here for extended periods. Dating of organic materials from wharf timbers, where preserved and trapped mollusk growth bands indicate episodic inundations and regressions from roughly 800 BC through the early centuries of the Common Era, a period that corresponds in some regional models to changing sea levels and sedimentation patterns. The presence of amphory fragments with stamped handles and interior residues of wine or oil suggests not only local maritime activity but participation in long-distance exchange networks. The chemical signatures in the residues match coastal viticulture centers thousands of kilometers away. Some scholars propose that Abaris was an inland terminus of a complex of estuaries and tidal channels that, in wetter climatic phases, created navigable avenues deep into what is now desert. Another theory posits that tectonic uplift or sediment infill gradually drained the harbor, rendering it useless to seafarers and forcing a pivot to terrestrial economy. A third line of thought, tinged with the dramatic, suggests episodic catastrophic events, sudden siltation after earthquakes or a climatic shock that cut the city off more abruptly than gradual change would explain. The mythic overlay here is rich. Local oral histories tell of ships stranded in sand like stranded beasts, of sailors who walked inland until the land swallowed their oars, and of a guardian sea spirit that, offended, remade the coastline. Picture yourself standing at the edge of an expanse where you can make out the ribs of an old ship under the sand, the wind tasting faintly of brine as you scrape a gloved hand across barnacle-encrusted planks that have lived on dry land for millennia. These objects force you to imagine a world in which maritime and desert economies braided together, where a captain's knowledge of tides mattered as much as a caravan leader's map. Still, despite dendrochronology and residue analysis, the tempo of Abaris's transformation, slow sedimentary retreat or sudden disaster, and the social mechanisms of adaptation that followed remain only partially understood. We still don't know. Not far from the vanished harbor, the landscape offers a quieter mystery that bites with intimacy. The Garden of the Sealed, an irrigated courtyard complex sealed beneath a layer of windblown silt, where horticulture and ritual coexist in a way both domestic and monumental. One-sentence teaser: Garden of the Sealed, a walled horticultural compound that preserved plant varieties, irrigation technology, and written lists of seeds like a snapshot of ecological knowledge. Excavation revealed planting beds, stone-lined irrigation trenches, and terrace plots framed by low walls. Botanical remains include not only domesticated cereals but also a surprising diversity of fruit trees, pomegranate, date, and a now rare grape cultivar whose seeds yielded compounds consistent with intentional grafting techniques. A cache of pottery labeled with incised tally marks and small tablets contain lists, if our reading is correct, of seed types and planting schedules. Radiocarbon dates indicate an occupation and intense cultivation period between roughly 400 BC and 100 CE. Interpretations diverge. One school reads the garden as elite-driven estate agriculture, a domain belonging to a ruling household that maintained specialized horticulture to support feasting, trade, and ritual. Another suggests a communal seed repository and experimental plot, a civic laboratory where farmers developed drought-resistant strains, an early agricultural research station, in other words. A third, more poetic view imagines the garden as a sacred microcosm, a reenactment of a cosmological orchard where cultivation and priestly ritual intertwined, planting as prayer, watering as sacrament. Local stories recall a sealed garden, guarded by descendants who kept seeds in secret during drought years, only to replant when rains returned. Picture yourself kneeling in black, cool earth, fingertip tracing the outline of old furrows as you inhale the heady scent of preserved grape must, and realize that knowledge about breath, season, and soil was accumulated here like rings in a tree. The Garden of the Sealed shows how material culture and environmental stewardship are inseparable. The plants tell us about taste and trade, about experiments with grafting and cultivar selection, and about the social arrangements that allowed such careful husbandry. Still, while archaeobotany and residue analysis give us species and possible grafting techniques, the social protocols, who held rights to seeds, how knowledge transmitted across generations, and how decisions were made under stress, remain opaque. We still don't know. Equally enigmatic are the ritual stones of the three brothers, a sequence of megaliths set in a near rectilinear pattern and carved with motifs that seem to change subtly as you move around them, a kind of topographic storytelling written in stone. One-sentence teaser: ritual stones of the three brothers, megaliths that might be territorial markers, ancestral tablets, or performative stages for rites that demanded certain sight lines and movements. The stones rise from the hardpan like the backs of great animals and are arranged with careful intervisibility. From any given stone a watcher can see two others, and the lines of sight intersect at a small, now-filled pit that held charcoal and organic residues. Petroglyphs on the stones include repetitive human figures in procession, stylized animals, and sequences of incised lines that some believe represent calendrical notation. Optically stimulated luminescence of sediments near the stone bases and radiocarbon from the pit suggest phases of activity spanning several centuries centered around the late 1st millennium BCE. Some interpret the stones as territorial markers, material claims to land visible over long distances in a flat landscape. Another reads them as mnemonic devices in an oral history tradition, physical books in a culture without paper where the stones encoded genealogies and migration stories. A third perspective, more performative, suggests the stones served as stages for rituals requiring precise acoustics and sightlines. The intersecting views created a choreography of movement, a social theater for marking seasonal or life cycle events. Folklore claims they memorialized three founding brothers who divided the land and whose quarrels shaped social orders. Other tales insist that under certain moons, the stones whisper. Picture yourself pacing a measured route between the stones, each step a repetition of a ritual, each stop a line in an ancestral narrative, and sensing how landscape, memory, and power are engraved into hard stone. The ritual stones demonstrate the human need to make the invisible visible, to map kinship and claim in a form that resists the wind. Still, despite careful measurement and cross-cultural comparison, their precise functions and the symbolic language of their carvings remain contested. We still don't know. Between these monumental projects and the intimate gardens there are always the small, stubborn things that complicate grand narratives. A child's toy found in a midden, assured with an inscription that might be a name, a bead whose composition hints at a trade route we had not imagined. These objects remind us that civilizations are not only systems of power and infrastructure, they are made of daily gestures, kissing a forehead, sealing a jar, teaching a child to thread beads. Every theory that leans too heavily on infrastructure alone risks flattening the human texture. When we dig, we must hold both scales, the macro, roads, citadels, causeways, and the micro, seeds, beads, toys. The paradox of the Sahara is that it hosts extremes, monumental labor side by side with improvisational survival. That paradox is why its archaeology so often produces competing, even contradictory interpretations. Still, these contradictions are not failures. They are the very engine of the discipline. They force new methods, new collaborations, and new humility. So as you stand now, in imagination or, if you are privileged, with a breeze lifting your scarf at some exposed dig, remember that each site we have visited is a stanza in a larger poem about human adaptability. The bronze causeway argues for spectacle and maintenance, the vanished harbor for shifting ecologies and hybrid economies, the garden of the sealed for careful environmental stewardship and botanical knowledge, the ritual stones for memory cemented in landscape. Each one insists on the complexity of cause and motive. Histories here rarely operate in monarchies. Instead, they play polyphonically, with climate, conflict, trade, religion, and chance all co-authoring human outcomes. We still don't know many things, but what we do know is enough to reframe the Sahara not as a gap in world history but as an active stage where human beings devised multiple ingenious ways to live, to remember, to claim, and to leave. We have walked a long way together across ruined plazas and sun-cut causeways, through workshops where sand became glass and courts where water made law, and into tombs that sing when the wind is right. We have measured isotopes, read charcoal rings, listened for echoes in stone, and sat with elders whose stories braided myth into memory. If you step back now and look at the map of everything we have seen, what forms is not a tidy timeline but a living web, cities that traded shells for salt, citadels that guarded water as if it were a god, libraries swallowed by mud that still whisper fragments of administration and poetry, and roads that stitch landscapes together even when the destinations have evaporated. These are not isolated curiosities. They are variations on a theme. People, faced with a demanding environment, invent systems of agriculture, of ritual, of craft, of governance that let them live, flourish, and sometimes disappear or transform. That pattern is humbling because it refuses the hero's story of progress and the tragedy story of collapse. It offers something more complex and, in many ways, more human: adaptation, contingency, improvisation, and the constant negotiation between scarcity and creativity. Think about the forces that shape these outcomes. Climate is not destiny, but it is a powerful actor. Shifts in rainfall patterns and river courses changed which valleys could support farms and which routes were viable for caravans. At moments when climate eased, networks expanded, tariffs were collected, goods moved like migrating birds, and cities grew. At moments when moisture waned, populations redistributed. Some places consolidated around wells and labyrinthine cisterns, others pivoted to pastoral mobility or traded labor for safety. Yet climate intersects with politics and technology. A well-engineered irrigation network can stretch tolerable conditions into several generations. A charismatic ruler can redirect trade by marriage, treaty, or war. A new kiln technology can alter consumption patterns and create markets where none existed. Human beings are not passive victims of the environment. They are actors who make decisions, sometimes brilliant, sometimes catastrophic, and the archaeological record is their ledger. But that ledger is incomplete and patchy. It records some actions clearly and leaves others to be inferred from subtle cues: a change in pottery temper, an abrupt stratigraphic gap, a sudden simplification of burial rites. We have seen that material culture often carries contradictory signals. At Tin-Bahru, celestial alignments invite religious readings. The measuring rods whisper of trade and engineering. At the City of the Mirrors, metallurgical evidence speaks of broad exchange networks while hastily built fortifications suggest insecurity. At the Sunken Library, bureaucratic fragments sit beside poetic marginalia. Dry ledgers rub shoulders with star charts. Those contradictions are not errors but evidence that past societies made choices across multiple domains: ritual and economy, ideology and practicality, prestige and survival. Our job as interpreters is to hold those tensions rather than reduce them. The most convincing reconstructions are those that let ritual and resource, festival and famine, coexist as genuine motivations for action. There is also a human rhythm to these sites that is worth honoring. For every monumental structure there are the small, stubborn traces of ordinary life: children's toys, food scraps, a scratched message on a pot rim. Those things tell us how people lived between the great decisions of statecraft and the impersonal movements of climate. They tell us how a mother salted a child's porridge, how an apprentice learned to blow glass in a kiln that sang with fire, how neighbors gathered to decide who would take watch at a cistern gate. When you read a ledger, remember the hands that wrote it. When you measure beams of timber, imagine the laborers who felled the tree and hauled it across a landscape that today is quiet. The archaeology hums with presence, with the messy texture of human life that refused to be only monumental or only marginal. Another major lesson is about connectivity. The Sahara's cities did not sit in splendid isolation. They were nodes and networks that often transcended what we imagine as ecological boundaries. Shells from the sea, pigments from river valleys, ores from distant mines, those materials moved because people moved: traders, migrants, diplomats, priests, artisans, and sometimes captives. Connectivity allowed for the diffusion of technique. A glass formula learned at Sal al-Abayad could appear in a distant workshop. A masonry trick used at the citadel of tall stones might echo styles found at a coastal port. That movement created cosmopolitan spaces where languages mingled, and where hybrid scripts and mythologies developed. There was no single Saharan culture. There were cultures of the Sahara, plural and intersecting, and sometimes startlingly sophisticated. Yet the archaeological record also shows that mobility had costs. Trade brought wealth, and wealth made people targets. Competition over key resources, water routes, metal, could produce conflict, and sometimes conflict produced ruins. But conflict alone rarely explains abandonment. Often a suite of factors: environmental stress, shifts in long-distance demand, political takeover, disease, combined in ways that amplified each other's effects. In other cases, communities chose to leave strategically. A seasonal site might be intentionally left to shift with rainfall. A defensive settlement might be abandoned as new alliances made another location safer or more profitable. That choice can be an act of agency just as much as a forced retreat. The record preserves both kinds of departures, sudden and traumatic, gradual and deliberative, and teasing them apart is one of the discipline's central challenges. We should also say something about myths' role. Myths, of giants, of singing stones, of roads left by gods, are not mere enchantments. They are ways to encode extraordinary events, and to make them meaningful across generations. The Sanger Elder's tale of men whose heads grazed the canopies may be an embellishment, but it also preserves a memory of exceptional stature or of a ritual practice that celebrated size as a social marker. The legend of the bronze causeway ringing like a bell might be poetic license, but the acoustic phenomenon of bronze and wind is real. Folk tales often draw attention to anomalies and keep them in cultural memory until investigators with trowel and test tube can follow up. As a result, modern archaeology benefits when it listens to oral tradition, not unquestioningly, but with curiosity and respect. When stories and science meet in dialogue, they can illuminate more than either could alone. The Sahara's lost cities also offer ethical lessons about stewardship and the entanglement of past and present. These ruins sit within landscapes that are home to living communities who shape, care for, and contest the meanings of those places. Archaeology has a fraught history of extraction and disconnection, but the best contemporary practice is collaborative, co-designing research questions with local stakeholders, ensuring that finds are curated and interpreted in ways that respect communal memory, and linking scientific discovery with tangible benefits, education, heritage management, and sustainable tourism that avoids exploitation. Preservation matters because these stones and seeds are not only evidence for scholars, they are anchors of identity for people who still live near them. Respectful research can not only answer academic questions but help communities reclaim narratives, preserve endangered traditions, and manage landscapes in sustainable ways. There is another reason these mysteries matter beyond academic curiosity and cultural justice. They challenge how we think about resilience. Most modern narratives around resilience imagine technical solutions, dams, crops, insurance. The Saharan past teaches that resilience is social and cultural as much as it is technical. Networks of reciprocity, ritual calendars that orchestrated shared work, flexible settlement patterns, and craft specializations all contributed to the capacity to survive and thrive in marginal environments. Where those networks frayed, vulnerability increased. Where they were reinvented or repurposed, communities persisted. In a world now facing rapid climate shifts, those lessons are invaluable. Innovation is not only about new technology but about institutional flexibility, social cohesion, and the ability to reorganize routines of cooperation. So what do we take away from this long stroll through ruins, labs, and legends? First, that the Sahara was never simply empty. It was a place of cities and experiments, of trade and songs, of libraries and kills. Second, that human ingenuity is often most evident when people live at the margins, because thrifty necessity breeds striking creativity. Third, that our attempts to explain past events must accept multiplicity, climate, politics, trade, ritual, and improvisation all interleave to produce outcomes we can sometimes explain only in part. Fourth, that myth and material culture are partners in the human effort to remember and to make meaning. And finally, that stewardship of this past is an ethical imperative, an invitation to collaborate with living communities and to make sure the voices of descendants matter as much as the voices of scholars. Before we close this journey, picture once more the scene that began it, a stretch of sand where the wind lifts away a single footprint to reveal the edge of a carved stone, a shard of glass, or the corner of a clay tablet. Imagine holding that small artifact in your hand and feeling the weight of human decisions, the choice to make objects that glitter, the choice to cut stone into a wall, the choice to set up a well, to record taxes, to draw a face and pigment across rock. Those are intimate choices, and they speak not only of survival but of meaning-making. The people who made those choices are not so remote as textbooks sometimes make them seem. Their daily lives are recognizable to us in simple ways: concern for kin, the desire for beauty, the struggle to control resources, the need to make a name without being forgotten. So go on, bring your curiosity, your skepticism, and your capacity for wonder. The Sahara's lost cities do not yield to arrogance. They require patience, humility, and a willingness to hold contradictory evidence in a single mind. They reward those who listen to elders and to sediments with equal attention, who respect both myth and essay results, and who see in ruins not mere problems to be solved but human lives to be honored. History, in this sense, is not a closed book, it is a conversation we keep having across millennia. The desert does not hide its past to vex us, it hides it because living things make choices that sometimes leave only enigmatic traces. Those traces are invitations, and the best stance we can take as investigators, as listeners, and as citizens of a shared planet is to accept that invitation. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.